We are getting into the first chapter of the Gita. Where do we leave off? Yeah.
We were just getting introduced to Sanjay, the preceptors, and the inevitability of war.
Yeah, I meant what verse, but that's correct. I think we... Um,
1:7 and 1:8.
Yeah, I think we're on text 12 is where we left off. And so just by way of recapping, there was a lineage, a dynasty, the Kaurava dynasty, the dynasty coming from Maharaj Kuru. And there were two branches of that dynasty. There were the sons of Pandu, who were known as the Pandavas, and there were the sons of Dhritarashtra, who were known as Kauravas. So they kept the family name, and then the Pandavas were a branch of that family. We're talking about emperors with really significant holdings and very significant armies and a treasury and land that they controlled. And the sons of Dhritarashtra, headed by Duryodhana, his 100 sons, they, through political maneuvering and deception and statecraft, they managed to take control of the country and exile the Pandavas, who were the rightful rulers, but their holdings were kept in trust by their uncle. So Dhritarashtra was the uncle of the Pandavas, the father of Duryodhana and his other children. But he was the uncle of the Pandavas, and he was the trustee that was left in charge of the estate, the kingdom, while the Pandavas came of age. But rather than being an executor of the estate, or the trustee of the estate. Trustee, right? Rather than being the trustee of the estate and the executor of the estate, he tried to steal it and give it to his sons. So you could imagine if Jeff Bezos had children and then died suddenly and left their ridiculous inheritance in the care of their uncle, his brother, and then the brother, through deceit and sleight of hand, attempted to steal the entire estate, kill the children, and give it to his sons. And he succeeded for a significant amount of time, let's say 15 years. But eventually a day of reckoning came, and the illegitimacy of his rule was exposed. And he was also taking advantage of the citizens. So the Pandavas, in addition to the fact that it was their rightful inheritance, they also had a duty to the citizens of their country to wrestle power back from this illegitimate dictator. It was violent dictator that had taken control through a combination of, political intrigue and assassination attempts. And you hear some of the stuff, like it couldn't possibly be true. But then the Ukrainians met with the Russians in Turkey and then got sick afterwards because the Russians are master of poison. And they shook hands, maybe with some cellophane with poison on it, and they shook hands, and then they all got violently ill, but they didn't die. And then the pundits are saying, oh, they didn't want to kill you, they just wanted to intimidate you. And so, because if they wanted to kill you, they would have. And you get enemies of the state in Russia dying of these really exotic poisons. It seems like Russia's a fan of exotic poisons. And so you hear this stuff in ancient India, and you're just like, come on, this couldn't possibly be true. But you hear whisperings of this kind of stuff still today in this world. And certainly if you read the history of India, there's just insane stuff. Brothers killing brothers, and did you guys put those mats away? Hopefully she's not stepping on with her shoes, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. Brothers killing brothers, and slaves rebelling against their masters. Well, that makes a lot more sense. But there were these Abyssinian slaves, these Ethiopian slaves, who took over part of the Mughal Empire. They killed their masters and took over. There were no indigenous slaves in India. There were indentured servants, but there was no actual slavery, chattel slavery, where you owned somebody. And not even the Roman slavery, where you didn't just own something as property. There were some very, very limited rights. It wasn't like that. There was indentured servitude, which is a much different animal. It's still terrible. Might qualify as human trafficking, but it's certainly nothing remotely resembling owning somebody. So you get this kind of stuff if you read the history of ancient India. And if you study enough of the history of the world, you find this kind of stuff going on. So, eventually a day of reckoning came. And the Pandavas were outnumbered about 2-1, maybe 1.75 to 1, but about 2-1. But they had to fight. It was a just cause. They owed it to the people, and it was their legacy anyway. It had been usurped from them. And so everybody went on the battlefield. And Dhritarashtra, technically the king, although his son Duryodhan, who was the Yuvaraj, the heir apparent, was actually controlling everything. Dhritarashtra can't see, he's blind. He asks Sanjay to describe what's happening. Sanjay describes what's happening. And the first person to speak is Duryodhan, who's speaking to his generals, Drona and Bhishma, who were also the gurus of the other side, because they were all raised together, part of the same family. And so the Pandavas and the Kaurava princes grew up together, had the same teachers. Before the assassination plots and the political intrigue, they were raised in the same household. So the gurus of Duryodhan, who were fighting with him, were also the gurus of the Pandavas. And they were great personalities, heroes, and also saints. Drona, especially Bhishma, is, a Mahajan, a great personality in the history of India, and his teachings are featured in our sacred texts. And so Duryodhana was talking to his generals, who were also the gurus of the Pandavas, and he was describing many of the warriors who were fighting. And there's a backstory to each warrior, because the Gita is 700 verses within a book that's 100,000 verses, so it's less than 1% of the text, and as such it makes reference to any number of people with backstories and the whole thing. And I think to properly understand the Gita, you might have to understand it to be like a really important chapter in General Hospital. which I think is run for 40 plus years, maybe 45 years, and maybe 100, 200 episodes a year. There must be 30, 40,000 episodes. I don't know, what the exact number is. Maybe it's not 200 episodes a year, maybe it's only 100, but we're looking at something in the realm of 40,000 episodes or something like that. So you can imagine that the Gita is, half a season of this 40-season show. But it makes reference to stuff. It's assuming you've watched all 40 seasons. And they made a movie out of the Mahabharata. It was nine hours, I believe. And they had a serial. It was many, many seasons. Probably 100 episodes. And they didn't even hit the whole thing. They just hit the major milestones. And it was still 100 episodes, some crazy amount of episodes. So it's not meant to be, you're not meant to watch a couple of years worth. You're meant to watch the whole thing. You're meant to understand the whole thing. And so each one of these personalities in the Mahabharata has a whole backstory. And some of that knowledge is valuable, and I try to share, I think, what the minimum amount of that knowledge that's important. And so Duryodhana's trying to convince his generals and his army that they can win. And they're scared. Because although the people they're fighting against are outnumbered, practically 2-1, they're pious. And they're the rightful rulers. And they're the better warriors. And so Bhishma, the great saint in our tradition, who was fighting on the wrong side, because he was obliged to, because he lived in that kingdom for all time, and the thread of continuity that ties the entire Mahabharata together is the thread of loyalty, which in a lot of ways isn't even argued for as a virtue. It's just assumed everybody has incredible loyalty. We don't find that loyalty is as all-pervasive in the world today. The more you go to the third world, the more you go more properly to the old world, the more you find that loyalty is in vogue. For instance, if you go to Africa, in the US, if you hire bodyguards, they protect you with their life because it's their brand and you pay them sufficiently that they put their life on the line. It's very mercenary. You pay for them to put themselves in harm's way. And their professionalism that you paid for is what gets you protected with their life. If you go to Africa, personal protection in Africa is done by your family. They may not be as well trained as the professionals, but they're your family. And the loyalty is not bought, it's earned because they're your blood. And so when you look at the old world, you find that loyalty and honor and things like this are much more prevalent. The classic example is when the Special Forces, the American Special Forces, invaded Africa and fought the Taliban. And they were being chased by the Taliban in Afghanistan, and they went to an Islamic village, wounded. But that Islamic village in Afghanistan is ultimately a Pashtun village called Pathans in India. You find this Pathans are there in Punjab, Kashmir, Jammu, Afghanistan, northern Pakistan. Big, strong, wheat-eating, tall, powerful. It's a martial race. The British had martial races. And so the Marathas and they were martial and non-martial races. And so they were deemed a martial race. The British deemed people, the Gurkhas were a martial race, the Marathas were a martial race, They had different groups of people, and they looked at them and they saw their build and the way they conducted themselves, and they either considered to be passive and weak and non-martial, or they considered to be strong and martial, and they would be conscripted into military service and such. Obviously, this is during the colonial period. And so they wandered into a Pashtun village where they followed Pashtunwali, or a code of conduct thousands of years old that is popular in all these Stan countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that those places. Hindustan was the old name for India. And so Stan means place in Sanskrit. So probably has a correlate, cognate term in, what's the language?
German, Stan?
No, the Indo-Aryan language. Yeah, I mean, not PIE, but there's an actual language from that part of the world. Its name is escaping me right now. Huh? PIE is a hypothesized language, but there's an actual language from that part of the world. Anyway, it's escaping me. It's not my thing. But it probably has a corollary in that Persian tongue, that archaic Persian tongue as well. Starts with an A, V. Okay. Anyway, so they wandered into a Pashtun village, and the rule is if you wander into a village and you're a guest, then the people in the village have to fight and defend you with their life, and they have to give you hospitality and protection automatically just because you walked into their village. So they walk in the village, ask for help, and now you've got people who are Muslims who are kind of friendly with the Taliban. They follow the same religion, they coexisted with them, they sure as heck have a lot more in common with the Taliban than they do with U.S. Special Forces. And the villagers broke out their AK-47s and went to battle and fought off the native forces and saved the lives of at least a couple of these soldiers, because that was their culture. You insult me, I'll die to get revenge. Someone wanders into my village, I'll protect them with my life. If everyone in my village dies, that's okay. That's a noble death. That's all right. That would definitely be preferable to living in cowardice and having broken the code that I've inherited from my forefathers for 50 centuries, whatever that amounts to, hundreds of generations. So the farther back you go, the more you get to an old world culture, the more loyalty is the order of the day, the month, and the year, and the decade, and the century. And so if you were to look for a thread of continuity that ties its way through the whole Mahabharata, it's the loyalty, which then manifested as some of these great personalities fighting on the wrong side because they'd been a part of that kingdom, they were part of that crew, and for better or for worse, these are my people, and I got to stand for them. My son got angry at me the other day. He got into an argument with somebody, and I stood with him in the argument. But then afterwards, I told him I didn't agree with him, and he was so offended. He got disrespectful, showing his lack of culture. But out of loyalty for my family, I'm obliged to stand with my son if it comes down to it. But it doesn't even necessarily mean I have to agree with him. Sometimes the bonds of loyalty, they get tested in those times. But in this case, it wasn't much of a test. He wasn't that wrong, and the other guy was even more wrong, and so it was an easy decision to make. But sometimes those bonds of loyalty get tested. And sometimes you stand with people, you might not agree with them, but you agree that they deserve to be stood with. Does that make sense? These ideas are not well understood today. Most people have a lack of basic virtue and integrity. They might not even know what integrity is, what to speak of being able to follow it. And most of the training we do is teaching people how to have integrity. As a church, that's what we're basically teaching people, is integrity. When you get back to where there wasn't a separation of church and state, then integrity becomes more a cultural phenomenon that everybody possesses. I think our basic integrity, our basic value system in the West is materialism and personal satisfaction and sensuality and individualism. That it's ultimately about you and what makes you happy. People can say, oh, I need to be true to myself. I need to look out for myself. I need to follow my bliss. Such ideas, although almost kitschy because they're so prevalent in our time and place, such ideas are totally foreign and bizarre to people, most people in the world who grew up in a familistic culture where the needs of your family supersede your own personal desires. And above all things, you're a member of a tribe. We ultimately get to this place when we get into nationalism. I mean, how would you have an army without people who have a better conception than just what's in it for me? The very principle of an army is you have people who are ready to die for a cause, for a group. And so when you start to look at police forces and armed forces in general, the only way you have a legitimate armed force that doesn't just lay down their weapons at the first sign of trouble and turn on their fellow officer is when you've instilled in them this sense that there's some things that are worth dying for. So it's not that these ideas aren't there. They're just not as much the gold standard. But they were in the Mahabharata. And so if you want to really understand all of the episodes and all of the seasons of the General Hospital that is the Mahabharata, if you understand this thread of continuity, the whole thing will make sense. So Bhishma, who was fighting against his own disciples and Krishna on the wrong side, hearing from this idiot, idiot savant. He was an idiot in the fundamental sense of being good, but he was super clever, so he was both. After hearing from, that's not really the proper meaning of idiot savant, but I'm redefining the term for tonight's class. After hearing from Duryodhana, Bhishma, this is text 12, the great, valiant grandsire of the Kuru dynasty, the grandfather of all the fighters, blew his conch shell very loudly, making a sound like the roar of a lion, giving Duryodhana joy. So the conch shell, in addition to being used in temple ritual, was also used at the outset of a battle the same way that you would use a buffalo horn, or the Vikings would blow. I don't know what kind of horn they were blowing, but they had some kind of horn they were blowing. And so the same way you would make sounds, beat drums, blow a trumpet, ring a bell. There's some sound which signals the beginning of the contest. That was the blowing of a conch shell. And so everybody had their personal conch shell. Everybody had their personal conch shell. And the conch shells were so famous, they were named. So just like you might name a great sword, you give a name to a sword, you personify a sword by giving it a name. Similarly, these conch shells would oftentimes be given names. And so you would have your personal equipment. And your bow might have a name. The Gandiva, Arjuna's bow was called the Gandiva. And you would have, or a sword that has a name. I'm sure, the Excalibur, the famous sword of the Arthurian myths. And so you would name a weapon, or in this case, a conch shell. Of course, Vishnu is famous for carrying a conch shell as well. Two of his symbols are more peaceful. They're blessing symbols, the conch and the lotus, and two of them are more fierce, the chakra and the gada, the club and the chakra. And then of the four symbols, two of them are the most powerful, the shank, water, and the chakra, fire. And so those two symbols are considered to be the most powerful. Like if you look at the Sri Vaishnava Sampradaya, they'll tattoo on your arms. Not tattoo, they'll brand you. When you get initiated in the Sri Sampradaya, one of the big Vaishnava lineages that we are beholden to for much of our theology, upon initiation, Diksha, you get the tapa, they brand you. They have a brand that they stick in a fire and heat up, and you get your arms branded. You know? Which sounds like creepy because there was that whole Nexium cult thing, but you know, I mean, it's an old school super gangster tattoo. Right? Anyway, so we do it too. The Gurukul in Mayapur, they had the brands. They would do the brand. I never did it, but so the boys there would brand themselves. As you know, regularly, like once a year, they'd redo the brand because it would fade, so they'd redo it. And so if you see a Sri Vaishnava, they have the brands around the shoulders from their initiation. Buddhists also brand 3 spots on their head. It's still done in Thailand, Theravada Buddhism, Thailand. It's a very common ritual to represent the triple sangha. So that was Bhishma. And then there was some, after that, the conch shells, drums, bugles, and trumpets and horns were all suddenly sounded, and the combined sound was tumultuous. So the battle's starting. They blew their side, signaling they were fighting, and the other side blows theirs, and then the battle is on. On the other side, Lord Krishna and Arjuna, stationed on a great chariot, drawn by white horses, sounded their divyao shankao, their 2 transcendental conches. Now, the fact that their conches are called transcendental definitely gives you an indication, just like the word dharma at the outset of the Gita, on the field of dharma the battle took place. It definitely gives you a little bit of foreshadowing of what the text is going to be about, of the difference between the 2 parties, and of who was ultimately going to be victorious. So you're starting to get some of these signs. Lord Krishna blew his conch shell, called Pancha Janya, and Arjuna blew his, the Deva Datta. Bhima, the voracious eater and performer of Herculean tasks, blew his terrific conch shell, called Poundra. So their conch shells all have names. And so they have names, they're transcendental, we're standing on the field of Dharma. You're getting some separation is being made between the men and the boys, between the 2 armies. There's some separation which is being made. King Yudhishthira, the son of Kunti, these are Arjun's brothers. So Bhima is one of his brothers, and he's got 3 more. King Yudhishthira, the son of Kunti, blew his conch shell, the Ananta Vijay, which means unending victory. So that's a rough one. You know, whenever you see somebody has an undefeated record, right? You're like, ooh, that's tough. That's going to be a tough fight. And Nakula and Sahadev blew the Sughosh and Mani Pushpaka, the great archer, the king of Kashi, the great fighter Shikandi, Dhritajumna, Virata, the unconquerable Satyaki, Drupada, the sons of Draupadi, and others, such as the mighty armed son of Subhadra, they all blew their respective conch shells. Satyaki was a really important warrior in the Mahabharata. He comes up a lot. Such a great personality. But anyway, they all blew their conch shells. The blowing of these different conch shells became uproarious, vibrating both in the sky and on the earth. It shattered the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra. So you could imagine, that you go out and you pick up a weight, you throw around a weight, do a big deadlift, hit a PR, everybody's clapping. And then the guy you're competing against goes out and starts doing reps with that weight. That's kind of what happened here. They made a big noise and they were all applauding each other and patting each other on the back. And then the other side, which was outnumbered, made some noise, and it was way louder. It was way louder. Sometimes you'll see this in modern day concerts where they'll say, okay, this half of the audience, let me hear you yell. This half of the audience, let me hear you yell. And they'll make some kind of competition between the sides. At that time, Arjuna, the son of Pandu, seated in the chariot bearing the flag marked with Hanuman. That's another one. Arjuna had Hanuman on his flag. And that's a big deal. Kapidvaj, monkey flag, which means Hanuman's on his flag. Hanuman gave Arjuna a blessing. He said, I'll go to battle with you and I'll make sure that you win. And so Arjuna's flag had the mark of Hanuman on it. Like you have these, I don't know what they call them, it's like a coat of arms, but sometimes you'll ride into battle with your coat of arms on the tapestry. And so it lets you know who's in what chariot, but it's also a way of flying your colors. Like when you look at gang culture and the Crips and the Bloods, of course, you've got Lime Street Crips. No, Lime Street Pyru. They have green as their color. So there are some gangs that have different colors besides blue and red. But when they talk about this flying your colors in a gang context, which is usually how most people are familiar with it, the colors that are associated with your gang, it has a long history in martial culture. Flying your colors was your coat of arms and the side you were on. And in the early days of sea warfare, you were allowed to fly the flag of other kingdoms to disguise yourself and slip through. But when you went to battle, you had to fly your own colors. And so you could go around on your boat initially and you could fly the colors of other kingdoms, then get past it. And then when you actually went to battle, you had to fly your own colors. So yeah, they had these colors they would fly, their coat of arms, and Arjuna's it was Kapidvaj. He had a monkey on his flag, and that was Hanuman, who blessed him that I will be with you in battle. And so Arjuna fought with the ferocity and the intensity of being empowered by Hanuman. It's another indication he was going to win. He took up his bow and prepared to shoot his arrows. O king, after looking at the sons of Dhritarashtra drawn in military array, Arjuna then spoke to Lord Krishna the following words. Now, the conch shells have blown, the battle's begun, Arjuna picked up his bow, That's it. The battle's happening. It's done. The bell is rung. The battle's happening. And Arjuna says, O infallible one, achyuta. Achyuta means infallible. O achyuta, please draw my chariot between the great army so I may see those present here who desire to fight and with whom I must contend in this great trial of arms. So Arjun knew well who was on the other side. Who was on the other side? His cousins. He knew that. And the time for talk was over. They had attempted to negotiate a peaceful settlement multiple times, at this point over decades. And it just wasn't going to happen. And so the battle lines were drawn. It was happening. There was no getting out of it. The conch shells had blown, which was the equivalent of ringing the bell. Arjuna picked up his bow, and ostensibly so did everybody else, because if you pick up your bow, the other guy's going to pick up his bow. We're poised. The battle should ensue, and in fact, the battle does ensue, and the Mahabharata has tons of battle scenes, and it paints a beautiful picture. It's incredibly illustrative language, and you get this wonderful picture of different battles that go on by reading the Mahabharata, and it really is like you're there. And we would expect that's what's going to happen next. And then Arjuna does this pattern interrupt and says, draw my chariot between the two armies. Now, who's he telling to draw his chariot? Krishna. So Krishna is being asked to drive Arjuna's chariot. Now that is it's an unusual position to see God in. The introduction of Krishna into the Gita in this verse is he's being ordered as a chauffeur. Chariot drivers were considered to be Shudras. They were considered to be Shudras. And so, they were part of this Sutta class. They were called, for some reason it's escaping me, Rati Putra, but that's not the term. The Suttas were the chariot drivers. There's another name for them, which it's escaping me right now. But they were a Shudra caste. And they were not considered to be warriors. And in fact, Sutta Putra, I guess, is actually what it is. And so Karna, who was actually Arjuna's older brother, and was never told he was Arjuna's older brother, so he fought on the bad guy's side against his own brother. Same mother, different father. So his half-brother. Karna, who was raised by a chariot driver, and who tried to vie for Draupadi's hand in marriage, and would have been able to win Draupadi's hand in marriage over all the other Pandavas because he was a way better fighter than all of them. He was told, no, you can't fight for Draupadi's hand in marriage because you're a Sutta Putra. You're a Shudra. You're not qualified to battle with Kshatriyas. And so irrespective of your ability, your just bloodline discredits you from even being in the same arena with us. And he was forced to leave the arena humiliated. So, just like a chauffeur in today's culture, or a taxi driver, or an Uber driver, is not a very high position in society. You're in the service industry, and your job is just to drive people around, and they don't have to talk to you, and they can roll up the dividing window if they want to. And to some extent, Uber has equalized that a little bit. It's like a friend is driving you somewhere, but especially like a limousine driver or something like that, there's a real separation between the chauffeur and the person who's being driven. And so it was no less so in the highly stratified old Vedic society of the Mahabharata. And so how is it that Krishna is introduced into the Gita in the role of a Shudra, a servant, driving a chariot? It's an unusual position, to say the least. It's a very anachronistic way to introduce God. flying down on a cloud, or appearing in the heart of a yogi, or with some fanfare on Garuda coming down on a great chariot. That would be the way that God would normally be introduced into a situation in our sacred texts. But here, there's no fanfare. Krishna's the chariot driver. And so it's subversive and anachronistic and an unusual occurrence, to say the least. And one that gets some commentary. Our commentators spent some time with this one. And there's two major commentaries. I think we might go a few more verses, but we'll see. There's two major strains of commentaries. There's everybody else's, and then there's our lineage. So all the other lineages say that although Krishna is a chariot driver, and there's a backstory. Krishna recused himself from the battle, said you got two choices. Either my whole army will fight on your side, with a few exceptions, because Satyaki stayed on this side. But either my whole army will fight on your side, or I'll fight on your side, but I won't fight. I'll just be there to advise you and assist you. And so Duryodhana got first pick, and he picked the army. And the Pandavas, if they gotten first pick, they would have picked Krishna. And it was Krishna who wasn't able to fight. So Krishna had taken a vow not to fight in the battle of Kurukshetra. And so he could only be there in an advisory capacity, and he decided to be Arjuna's chariot driver, which is a weaponless, non-martial, non-kshatriya, Shudra level position. And Krishna chose to put himself in that position as part of this rule that I'm not going to take sides, I'll be nonpartisan, and I'll split it. You can either have my army, you can have me, and if you have me, I won't even fight. Now, Krishna ultimately did end up fighting, very briefly, for just a moment. Bhishma, the great warrior and saint, who I mentioned earlier, was fighting on the wrong guy's side because of loyalty, which was the gold standard for all old world cultures, and is somehow vacant in our culture, and it's something that has to be learned, and it's very difficult for people to learn. But that familistic, nationalistic, the loyalty to my tribe, loyalty to my people, which you find in all martial cultures, because there's no way to have a martial culture without it. Even in gang culture you find this. I remember as a young man, when I was associated with gangs, there was like a very strong, very powerful, stated fidelity that you would die for your group. It was an ever-present feature of conversations, that you're ready to die for your tribe, for your people. Very military-esque. And you don't really see it outside of, at least I didn't see it outside of gang culture. Sometimes in old world family cultures they talk like this. And certainly in the military they talk like this, because there's no way to have a military unless you got people who are willing to die standing next to each other for a cause that's bigger than themselves, and then widow their spouses and make their children father or motherless. We could just say fatherless, because 99.9% of battlefield deaths over a recorded history are men. So yeah, Bhishma because he was fiercely loyal, because that was the culture at that time, and the thread of continuity that runs its way through the way and the weft of the entire Mahabharata as the basic explanatory factor that explains all actions is loyalty to Dharma and clan above all else. Bhishma had a desire, and his desire was to fight Krishna. He didn't want to beat Krishna, but he wanted to fight Krishna. He was a great military general, a great teacher of combat. He wanted to fight Krishna. And so Bhishma took a vow that he would get Krishna to fight. And Krishna took a vow that he would not fight. And guess who won? The devotee won. Bhishma ultimately attacked Arjuna so ferociously that his chariot was broken. Arjuna was done for, and to protect Arjuna and save his life, Krishna picked up the chariot wheel, which had fallen off the chariot. They were stuck in the mud, literally. And Krishna picked up the chariot wheel and rushed at Bhishma and fought Bhishma. And there's this beautiful painting that was done by our devotees of Bhishma standing there looking like a pious Bane with his arms out like this and looking venerable and at the same time incredibly mighty, and Krishna rushing at him with a chariot wheel over his head. It's a beautiful painting, not just from the point of view of appreciating martial culture and heroism and valor taken to its limit. You know, like, I mean, I shouldn't say this because it's recorded, but I appreciate the integrity of Islamic fanatics. That they have a belief system and they're willing to die to live up to their belief system. Integrity is that you walk your talk and you live up to your values. I don't agree with their values. I don't agree with their conception of divinity. I don't agree with their value system. But you can disagree with somebody's value system and appreciate them living up to their values and at least having a basic sense of integrity, that I will follow through on what my value system says. Integrity is to be whole, to live up to your values, which leads to the possibility of someone having integrity and having a terrible value system. Which means that you have to learn to appreciate the integrity and critique the value system, but not to assume that the bad value system necessarily indicates a lack of integrity. Unless, you want to then assume that, a necessary value to have is this, and without that, any integrity you have of following your value system doesn't count. But it's certainly not the etymological meaning or the dictionary meaning of the word integrity. The word integrity is non-judgmental. It just means that you follow your values. It does not say what your values have to be. That's another conversation. Do you guys follow that? So, how did I get into this? We're talking about Bhishma and the beautiful painting.
Two different accounts of why Krishna's the charity.
Yeah, I know that, but I'm deep into a tangent. I'm into Bhishma.
That painting?
Why Krishna? Why it's that Krishna?
In addition to the valor idea and the beauty of a military culture and the heroism of Krishna's fighting with a chariot wheel against Bhishma, who's standing on a chariot with a bow and arrows, like a foot soldier fighting against a soldier on horseback, and willing to pick up just a chair to fight. Well, there's one devotee, his name is Mahavir, big, strapping devotee, black, big and strong. I met him 35 years ago for the first time. And he was American, but he went to Africa and served in Africa. I believe East Africa, back in the early 70s. And some natives attacked our temple. They heard the deities were made out of gold. It happens sometimes. And so they attacked the temple with spears. So it was like spear-wielding African tribal natives who attack our temple. And Mahavir jumped up on the altar with a chair to fight them off. And he had big marks on his arms where he was cut. I see he had scars. It was like a well-known thing in the Hare Krishna movement that he'd gotten these scars protecting our temple. One of our sannyasis got his leg blown off, protecting our temple in Mayapur, Bhakti Raghav Swami. And so, when you hear about these devotees who put themselves in harm's way and were ready to give their lives for the mission to protect the temple, it's inspiring. It shows a depth of faith and a willingness to really live your faith. So there's a sheer heroism of the image. But the deeper thing that's going on in the painting is that Bhishma had a desire to fight with Krishna. And Krishna had a vow not to fight. And Krishna broke his own vow to keep the vow of his devotee intact. And that indicates a deity who is less attached to the rule of law, less attached to justice, and more attached to mercy and grace and love. Only a deity that valued love over power would break his own promise to keep the promise of his devotee. It's a very subversive, anachronistic notion of divinity. That Krishna is a loving deity, so much so that he'll break his own vow to keep the vow of his devotee intact, because Krishna loves his devotee just that much that their reputation is more important to him than his own. It's a very Shakespearean, intimate, almost romantic conception of divinity. And it's certainly, if you think about it, is a beautiful conception. So that's what was symbolized by that event. Now, the normal commentary on why Krishna was driving a chariot is to say, but he was called Achyuta. He took a vow, he couldn't fight, so he drove the chariot. But even though he was driving a chariot, he's called Achyuta, which means infallible. So he didn't really become a Shudra. He didn't really become fallen by taking that lowly position. Even in that lowly position, Krishna was still pure. Like a diamond in the mud is still pure. Like a piece of gold in a dirty place is still a piece of gold. And so even though Krishna was in that low fallen position, he was not actually fallen. He was Achyuta, and therefore Arjuna refers to him as Achyuta. You follow? That's the generic commentary. Our tradition's commentary, very similar to the commentary on Bhishma and Krishna fighting, is that Krishna is Achyuta because he's infallible in that he will never abandon his devotee. And he will always stay there with him and take any role in his devotee's life that's required to help them. And therefore, Krishna became infallible because he was willing to take the role of a charioteer, a chauffeur for his devotee. And that's actually his infallibility. In every circumstance, Krishna will remain by your side and help you, and never abandon you, and never forsake you. This subversive, anachronistic, unusual, bizarre, out-of-the-box way of thinking about God is our tradition. And you see some language in the Gita which allows itself to be commentated on like this. And you see our lineage that has this loving, intimate conception of the divinity. You see them exploiting that language and that poetry and that scene to make very, very important theological points for our tradition. Certainly both points could be true. Despite being a chariot driver, Krishna is never contaminated, and Krishna's willingness to never leave his devotee is part of his infallibility. And certainly devotees who practice Krishna consciousness with a reasonable degree of sincerity and depth. Experience. Occasionally, in very profound ways, and regularly as well, they experience Krishna not forsaking them and being there for them in the most difficult moments of their life. And just like that Hallmark card, you were walking and you'd look next to you and you'd see a second set of footprints and you knew that God was always with you. But then in your time of greatest need, there was no second set of footprints, and you finally meet God at the end of your life and you say, why did you abandon me? I only saw one set of footprints. My whole life you were there for me. And then in my time of greatest need, you forsook me and you abandoned me. And Krishna says, no, at that time you couldn't walk. I was carrying you. The footprints were my own because you were too weak to walk on your own, and so I had to pick you up. This basic idea of the loyalty of Krishna and the love of Krishna unendingly manifested towards the devotee who opens that door is beautiful, it's transcultural, it's ever present in our sacred texts. Sometimes it's more direct, sometimes it's less direct, but it's always there. It's another thread of continuity. And so the same way that the loyalty is a thread of continuity that runs its way almost unstated through the entire Mahabharata and it becomes the key or the legend to unlocking what's going on in the text when people sometimes do things which would seem to be at odds with virtue, it's because loyalty is the ultimate virtue. Similarly, you find Krishna's ultimate virtue in the Mahabharata and Vedic texts in general is his loyalty, in that he never forsakes his devotee, never abandons them, always stays with them, defying all rhyme or reason, defying all logic, defying what's fair, defying what's just, and it becomes a gracious, merciful, sweet Lord. George Harrison got it right when he said, "My sweet Lord." There's a sweetness, and that is the defining feature of Krishna. And if you think about it, this is the feature that a serious conception of divinity needs to have. And you see it here with Krishna. And so the popular commentary that Krishna's infallible, even though he was in a low position, we think that's like an external definition. We think the real explanation is that Krishna's infallible precisely because he'll become your chariot driver, precisely because he'll pick you up and carry you, precisely because he'll break his own vow to keep yours, precisely because he loves his children just that much, that he never forsakes them, that he's always present, that he stows away in your heart, that he never gives up on you, that he never abandons you, that he's always right there, that even if a devotee runs with his eyes closed, Krishna will stop him from falling. Thank you very much, IGTV. We made it in under 60.